Speak white. It sounds so good when you speak of paradise lost and of the gracious and anonymous profile that trembles in Shakespeare's sonnets. We are an uncultured, stammering race, but we're not deaf to the genius of a language. Speak with the accent of Milton and Bryan and Shelley and Keats. Speak white, and forgive us our only answer being the Russia song of our ancestors and the sorrows of Nelligan. Speak white. Talk about this and that. Tell us about Magna Carta or the Lincoln Memorial, the great charm of the Thames, the pink waters of the Potomac. Tell us about your tradition. As a people, we don't really shine, but we're quite capable of appreciating all the significance of crumpets and or the Boston Tea Party. But when you really speak white, when you get down to the brass tacks, to talk about the gracious living and speak of standing in life and the great society, a bit stronger than speak white. Raise your foreman's voices. We are a bit hard of hearing. We live too close to the machines and we can only hear the sound of our breathing over the tools. Speak white and loud so that we can hear you. From St. Henry to St. Dominic, what an admirable tongue. For hiring, giving orders, setting the time for working yourself to death, and for the pause that refreshes and invigorates the dollar. Speak white. Tell us that God is a great big shot and that we're paid to trust Him. Speak white. Talk to us about production profits and percentages. Speak white. It's a rich language. For buying, but for selling your soul, but for selling out. Speak white. Big deal. But to tell you about the eternity of a day on strike, to tell the story of how a race of servants lived, but for us to come home at night at a time that the sun snuffs itself out over the back street, but to tell you, yes, that the sun is setting, yes, every day of our lives to the east of your empires. There's nothing to match our language of swear words, our none too clean palu, greasy and oil-stained. Speak white, be easy in your words. We are a race that holds grudges, but let's not criticize anyone for having a monopoly on correcting language. In Shakespeare's soft tongue, with the accent of Longfellow, speak a pure and atrociously white French, like in Vietnam, like in the Congo. Speak impeccable German, a yellow star between your teeth. Speak Russian, speak call to order, speak repression, speak white. It's a universal language. We were born to understand it, with its tear gas words, with its nightstick words. Speak white. Tell us again about freedom and democracy. We know that liberty is a black word, just as poverty is black, and just as blood mixes with the dust in the streets of Algiers and Little Rock. Speak white. From Westminster to Washington, take it in turn. Speak white like they do on Wall Street, white like they do in Watts. Be civilized and understand us when we speak of circumstances. When you ask us politely, how do you do? And we hear you say, we're doing all right, we are doing fine, we are not alone, we know that we're not alone.
African History Daily by my daddy.
If you did not know this poem, you may have thought it might be a cry of despair of an African poet in the years of independence struggle. And you would be right, because this magnificent text perfectly describes the realities of colonized or oppressed peoples, speaking of a critical crisis of the African identity that is the language, its place, its science, its role, and its projections. But this poem is not from an African, since it was written in October 1968 by the Canadian writer Michel Lalonde in support of Pierres Vallières and Charles Gagnon, who were then imprisoned for their activities within the liberation movement for Quebec. But before becoming a poem, Speak White is first and foremost a racist and derogatory expression, an insult to abuse minority groups that speaks a language other than English in a public place. In the colonial context of Canada and during the time of slave trade, this insult meant that a slave should not speak his language and must adopt that of his masters. This insult, hundreds of African school children have heard and still hear it. They who are learning English or French, Portuguese or Spanish before Bambara or Shona. It is undeniable that Speak White is the daily life of many Africans, it is for them also that was deployed the talent of Michel Lalande, the African. My African cliché of the day is an incredible book titled White Negroes of America, a classic Canadian literature that draws an astonishing parallel between the situation of African Americans in the 1960s and that of French Canadians at the same time in Canada. When Pierres Vallières wrote this book in 1960 while in prison in New York, had he only imagined that 60 years later the situation of French Canadians will be significantly improved, while that of African Americans will remain unsustainable in many respects? Did he imagine that his book would be so full of similarities on the situation of millions of marginalized Africans in their own countries, marginalized by their own leaders, marginalized in education, in healthcare, in decent food and housing? So what about you then? Do you speak white? What do you think of the fact that Africa today have languages to speak with the old masters, but not to talk to each other? What do you say about African states that speak white to an African Union that has taken a resolution asking them to teach Swahili in all African schools? From the book White Negroes of America to the poem Speak White, from Pierres Vallières to Michel Lalande, from Bamako to Mbaban, as well put by Thomas Sankara, all right causes always come together. And as for me, it is time to say Kaide Nawan, meaning goodbye in Oji Herero language of Namibia. Thank you and see you next time.